Dr. DiEuliis, Diane, if I may.
Yes, please do.
Welcome. We are excited that you're here to talk about your recent work on biodeterrence. But before we get started, if you could just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you to NDU.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's great to be with you today. So I have worked across federal government and wearing a number of different hats, but many related to emerging biotechnology, biosecurity, and biodefense. And for the last 10 years, I worked at NDU as a distinguished research fellow and instructor there in what was then known as the Weapons of Mass Destruction Group, of course, under INSS, the Institute for Strategic Studies. And so now I am working adjunctly as an expert consultant, continuing on many of these issues, and most recently spent the last year working on the Biothreat Deterrence Project, which was quite gratifying.
Abdullah and I had a wonderful opportunity to read your research, and we wanted to ask, your team's report introduces a framework for biological weapons deterrence. Why is this concept gaining traction now?
Yes, so what a great question, because it's started all of this research really. A couple of years ago, I was involved in something called the Biodefense Posture Review, and we have one for nuclear weapons. We had never done one before for biological weapons, and I was involved in that process, and we talked about deterrence, but we didn't define it, and we didn't dwell on what biothreat deterrence really meant in that report. We focused on building better biodefense capabilities across the department. And this, of course, in the aftermath of COVID. So that's a great report. And it talks a lot about deterrence, and it talks a lot about getting past the focus on threats that are only related to a certain set of pathogens that we're aware of, right? And we call this the select agent list. And for many decades, we focused on that. However, now we have all kinds of emerging capabilities in biotechnology. So people can engineer biology to do many different things, whether that is the creation of a high-value chemical, the creation of a novel material, or the creation of pathogens from scratch, or the engineering of pathogens. So understanding that the threat has really broadened really was the impetus for having a biodefense posture review. And so we're now taking that a step further and saying, we mentioned biothreat deterrence in this approach, and now we really need to dive down and determine what constitutes biothreat deterrence. And we had a couple of workshops at NDU over the past year and invited a lot of experts in to discuss this topic. And the report is now the result of that.
And if you can help provide a little bit more context. So for our audience, can you explain how is biodeterrence different from traditional biodefense?
Right. So biodefense, and by the way, I will start by saying we have very strong biodefense capabilities in the United States and public health capabilities as well. Those were put to the test during COVID, and we can talk a little more about that later. But the traditional biodefense that we have is by and large sort of right of bang, right? It's reactive. It waits till something grows, happens, becomes a threat, and then we have to defend against the threat. So in other words, we do biosurveillance, we look for disease occurrence to happen, we evaluate where that's coming from, whether it's natural or man-made or perpetrated, we develop diagnostics, we develop medical countermeasures, and we make ourselves so strong and resilient against that threat that we deny adversaries any benefit from trying to harm us in that way. If we're so strong and we can defend ourselves against it, it sort of sends their decision calculus in a different direction than attacking us with diseases. Now, as I mentioned, that traditional focus has been on, so it's right of bang and it's reactive, but its preparatory focus has been on that list of bad germs that are out there, the bad pathogens, the things that we've always known about, like anthrax and smallpox and so forth. And we've used that list of things to base our traditional deterrence on. So we want to get past that list, because with emerging technologies, our adversaries may do something quite different than is expected. They may use a different kind of pathogen or something that's been engineered. But as well, we want to try to get left of bang. What kinds of things can we be doing to deter someone from trying to use biological weapons without getting all the way up to them using it? So what's on the left side of that we can potentially prevent them from going there? So these kinds of things have been talked about in other areas, like in the nuclear world, but we haven't dealt with that as strongly in the biological world. So, for example, things like export controls, things like potential economic sanctions against an adversary that we think may be tinkering with biological weapons. Maybe we would want to interrupt some supply chain activities or do some interdictions, use other kinds of economic strategies in that regard. So that's the area we wanted to explore. And this is sort of the cost imposition. So as opposed to making it, denying the adversary a benefit, this is, we're going to make it cost you something to do this as well. So it will be unattractive for you to choose to use against us, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you so much, Diane. And so I'd like to kind of maybe switch to make this a little bit, or I guess zoom out a little bit to the maybe strategic level for strategic context here.
Mm-hmm.
What does biodeterrence posture look like in a place like Indo-Pacific? I mean, you've already kind of alluded to a little bit of this with respect to I guess maybe the mechanisms to do what you just described as the cost imposition. But what does a biodeterrence posture look like?
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned Indo-PACOM. I have always said that the Surgeon General for Indo-PACOM has one of the most challenging jobs in the Department of War. And so many people know that over half the world's population lives in the Indo-PACOM area or region. But what they may not know is that over 50% of the world's diseases are endemic to Indo-PACOM. And so it's always been an area of focus and importance strategically, as you've said, not only for force health protection of our troops that are deployed there and working there, but also for biothreat awareness. And we have adversaries, obviously. Our biggest adversaries are in that region: China, Russia, North Korea. It's so critical to the DoD mission space, and we have so many assets there. So I think this is a great place operationally to begin a lot of the biosurveillance activities that we want to expand on. We talk a little bit about that in the report, how we could be doing better and faster biosurveillance that gives us early warning. It's very critical. And also maybe testing out some better forensics and attribution in that region. Indo-PACOM is a great place to focus on strategically.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation there. I really appreciate that. And I guess, one thing I guess to follow up on that is in terms of what capabilities exist to the best extent you can explain possible. I know given our classification here, but in terms of talking about this as a new concept, is this a new concept, or is this something that you have kind of described as an integration of capabilities that already exist, they haven't been really framed already as deterrence?
Right. I would say some of these tools are not new. Certainly the overall concepts that we discussed in biothreat deterrence are borrowed from nuclear deterrence and other arenas. But some of those specific tools, we've talked about them in the biothreat world, but not in a cohesive way. So for example, I mentioned export controls as a potential tool. And we've talked about this before. We use export controls in the biothreat arena, but typically we use them as anything focused on the capabilities related to that select agent list or very specific technologies related to that list. And as I mentioned, we're getting in a place with emerging biotechnology that's expanding beyond those traditional threats. So what other components do we need to add to export controls to make them more functional in today's threat arena? So that's just one example, but there's something larger here that I didn't mention in the context of the first question that Elena asked me, and that is how biotechnology is being used outside of its traditional sectors, right? So we call this the bioeconomy, and this is engineering biology to make any kind of commodities. I mentioned chemicals, materials, other things. In other words, not just health and medicine and agriculture, which are the traditional biotechnology sectors, but many other sectors are now interested in using biotechnology and bioengineering to do things in the economy. So this could be, energy, materials, chemistry, lots of other areas. So many countries want to have a bioeconomy. We are building our bioeconomy. China wants to be the global juggernaut of bioeconomy. So as we're competing in this space, people are expanding all these tools and capabilities, and that means industries are growing, cross-industrial collaborations are happening. And for example, many countries are collaborating with China, Europe, Asian countries on building these bioeconomic tools and products that they want to sell to contribute to the bioeconomy. So in other words, not just a petroleum-based economy, but now moving to this bio-based economy. And it's very exciting. So from that perspective, that opens up a world of other kinds of tools that are economically based. Maybe we will say as a country, if we think another country is building biological harms or contemplating biological harms or using biotechnology in a negative way, we could say, well, this is a country we would impose sanctions against, or this is a country that our industries are not going to collaborate with their industries in particular ways. So in other words, putting some of these tools and levers of economic power in that global context of how biotechnology is growing around the world, I think is going to have a role to play in this space. And that is all new. So maybe some traditional tools and ideas, things we borrow from conceptually traditional deterrence, but I think there's going to be novel space to grow there.
And if I can add a little bit more to that in terms of deterrence and how it works in practice. So your framework, it outlines deterrence by denial, cost imposition, and restraint. Where is the U.S. strongest today, and where are we most exposed?
So I said at the beginning, we've traditionally been very strong in public health in this country and in force health protection in the Department of War. We have very strong biodefense programs. We make lots of diagnostics, medical countermeasures, and we do very broad biosurveillance and epidemiology. So we're very strong there. Now, can all of that be better? Yes, absolutely. And we want to make all of our traditional pillars of public health and biodefense better. Again, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, where we discovered some areas where we had vulnerabilities, right? We want to learn about, get the earliest warning from when things are threatening to us, and certainly where they are coming from. But we need to do much better on intelligence. What do we know about our adversaries and whether or not they are intending to use biology in harmful ways? And understanding very quickly whether something is natural or perpetrated. I think one of the really hard things that happened that was damaging during COVID is that we were not able to say with rapidity or confidence or fidelity exactly where SARS-CoV-2 emerged, whether it was naturally occurring or from a laboratory. And so while those debates go on, we lose public confidence and public trust in our very strong institutions of public health and force health protection. One other space I'll add where I think we are going to need some shoring up is the Biological Weapons Convention. So while we all say that biological weapons are bad, and every country that signs on to the Biological Weapons Convention agrees that this is an abomination and should not happen, if there is a violation of the BWC, we really don't have much that happens in recourse of punishment against the bad actor. So I think that's an area that we're going to need to work on in the future. We are, I believe, just passing the 50-year anniversary of the Biological Weapons Convention. And I know that the State Department has determined this is a great time to reassert ourselves to agreement with what the BWC stands for, and to get our allies to do the same. But we need to be ready to say what we will do if indeed a country uses biological weapons. In no uncertain terms, like this will happen if you take this step. And right now, we don't really have that. We don't have cost inhibitions that might deter our adversaries.
Now, that's incredibly insightful. So I wanted to continue on with that and then ask about attribution. So attribution remains difficult in the biological domain. Without it, how do we maintain credible deterrence?
Great question. In my mind, one of the most obvious things in deterrence, it says, if you do this, we will catch you and we will know that it is you, right? That's sort of a basic fundamental deterrence concept. So unlike some other areas in the world of all threats, biology is not one that is done out in the open, right? Unlike when, missiles are paraded in some kind of military parade in the town square, people aren't parading petri dishes full of awful germs in that same kind, unless they're trying to kill everyone, which I guess is not the best analogy there. But you understand what I'm saying. Traditionally, the development and intent on biological weapons has always been done in the shadows because there is such an adverse norm against their use. And so during COVID, I'll go back to that example. Our adversaries were given a very good look at exactly what all of our weaknesses are in responding to a pandemic of that scale and size. So you can look across and say, we were slow on diagnostics. We had communication problems with the public. I already mentioned sort of the lack of ability to attribute SARS-CoV-2 quickly and reliably, which compromised public trust and so forth. We did well in other areas, but I think it gave adversaries ideas that maybe we don't need to have a biological weapon that kills lots of people. Maybe we'd like to use a biological weapon that simply frightens people or causes economic instability. We had a lot of that during COVID, or that causes fear in a populace. Or maybe we just want to contaminate an area and prevent warfighters from being able to do their jobs in that area. So it opened up sort of this strategic view, this potentially strategic use of biological weapons that I think we are not prepared for right now, and that biothreat deterrence could assist us in that regard.
Okay, so maybe if it's okay, we can shift into some of the strategy. I mean, you've already been outlining a lot of this
Mhm.
already. So, uh, what kind of steps that I guess the department can take to move from a concept that you've so outlined so well to an operational biodeterrence strategy?
Yeah, great question. So this really gets to the heart of what's in that study and what we benefited from all of those folks who came and gave great advice into this process. I think the first thing that the Department of War needs to do is sort of develop a dedicated biodeterrence strategy. Sort of what are the tools that we have that we would like to utilize? How do we want to utilize them? I mentioned some of the tools. And when I talked about the fact that these tools exist and they're not used cohesively for biothreats, a strategy will enable us to do that. So what kind of threats do we think we're talking about and the tools we could use, but also what kind of adversaries and what kind of particular approaches are going to work with specific adversaries depending on their capabilities, right? So a strategy will afford this. I think, as we mentioned in the last question, forensics and attribution are really difficult, and that's going to be an area that we need to work on, and that includes intelligence. I'm putting that into the mix. We need to know where to look and why, and then when we do look, what do we find? Um, when I talked before about right of bang, we're waiting until people get sick or animals get sick or something happens. We could be looking to the left of bang with our surveillance capabilities. Maybe we should be looking in wastewater. We learned a little bit how to do that during COVID. Maybe we should be looking at air filtration systems and looking at, do we see something that's abnormal here, even before people actually get sick? Or there pathogens that we could detect? So that's something I think we need to do. And then finally, we need to really broaden the discussion. While this report was geared towards the Department of War and building a strategy to protect our war fighters and do better and expanded biodefense, I think we need to bring in all the other components of federal government that have roles in public health and awareness and the development of all these kinds of tools across the board, bringing them together into helping us develop what that strategy might look like.
So, as we look towards the future, what is the greatest risk if we fail to develop a coherent biodeterrence strategy now? And as we continue to look ahead, which emerging technologies, then, for example, AI, synthetic biology, distributed labs, most complicate deterrence?
Yeah, that's well, to your first question, the most obvious risk is that we are attacked with some kind of biological weapon, and we are not prepared and we are harmed by that. That's obvious, but I know what you're thinking beyond that, right? If we don't have a deterrent strategy, we compromise in both ways. We're rushing forward with the development of biotechnologies for our benefit, and we really need to be paying attention to what the harm side looks like. And the more that we are aware of that, the more that we can position ourselves as being a leading voice in that arena and really helping to perpetuate the norm against biological weapons. In this work, many people will say, we don't see a lot of biological weapons use. Why are you focusing on this biothreat deterrence strategy? And it's because of this growing bioeconomy and the growing capabilities we have with biotechnology. It's only going to get broader and broader. So we need to do this now so that we can maintain our awareness of the security threat and be a leader and a voice in the community in that way. So I'm glad also for the second question, because during this interview, I haven't said a lot about AI yet, and I could. That's a whole podcast in of itself, is the convergence of AI with biotechnology, and I would love to come back sometime and do that talk. But in short, I will say that of all the things that we have concern about, in the biothreat arena, whether it's someone creating an extinct pathogen, creating a novel pathogen, engineering a pathogen, doing a gene drive, attacking livestock or crops in nefarious ways. We've always had those concerns. AI is something that enables an adversary to get lots and lots of coherent information on how to do those things. How do you bioengineer an anthrax molecule to or an anthrax bacteria to be resistant against an antibiotic, for example, or whatever that might be. There's AI sitting right out there that people can ask these questions and get very tangible information, not only on what to do, but how to do it. So they can get ideas, but then the AI helps them, how could I carry out this idea? So I'm very concerned about that. It goes beyond been possible before and makes it possible to a much wider group of actors. So consider it like a force multiplier.
Diane, thanks so much for everything. And just in sum, this report really insightful. What message should this report send to any potential adversaries of the U.S.? If you could kind of take a stab at that.
Wow. So that gets into the communication piece of something we covered when doing this study is, communicating our intent is really important. And communicating, I mentioned before, the BWC and sort of recommitting ourselves to the BWC. I think declaratory policy is important. In other words, saying, we decry biological weapons on all fronts. We're prepared to deny you any benefit from using them against us, but also we think that these other things should be in place to even further deter you from wanting to do this. So it's sort of, I don't want to say putting on notice, right? Because we've always had this position against biothreats, but I think this will strengthen it. And I think it will also help us discuss this topic with our allies and, NATO, other nations that are also struggling with the biothreat problem, and bringing sort of a global consensus to continue the norm against biological weapons that we never want to see happen.
Dr. DiEuliis, thank you so much for coming on this show and for sharing your highly relevant insights on this topic. And hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to have you back to talk about biodeterrence and AI, which sounds like an absolutely fascinating topic we'd love to have you on for. So thank you again so much.
Great. Thank you. Would love to do it. Abdullah, Elena, lovely chatting with you today.